So in Gurdjieff's Beelzebub's Tales, also known as All and Everything, he talks about a lot of things and about the earth, how important the earth is for us. We live on it, we should be looking after it. But in the chapter Beelzebub's Opinion of War, he talks about some of the societies that were created to try and, make things better for humanity. There was different societies created, such as the Assembly of the Enlightened. And he says about these, "Here it must be noticed that in those days the brothers of this fraternity were beings who were very much venerated by other free-brained beings around them of almost the whole of that planet, and hence this brotherhood was sometimes also called the Assembly of all the living saints of the earth. This brotherhood of the free-brained terrestrial beings had already long before been formed of such beings, who had also noticed in themselves the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, and had banded together to work collectively for their deliverance from these properties." Now, I've talked about the Kundabuffer with Josh on some of the shows we've done and my own shows. That Kundabuffer was the thing that made us see everything topsy-turvy and upside down and round the wrong way. And it was taken away from us, but still people live deluded, as they say. Gurdjieff says we live in this lunatic asylum, which is such a shame, because we live on this beautiful planet. But this lunatic asylum is run by people who, we have psychopaths, sociopaths and such like who seem to manage to get in charge. But they're not harmonised. Their centres are all out of sync and out of order, and many of them who are in charge are people that feel they know a better way for us all to live, rather than letting people be free to live for themselves and to work for themselves. And Gurdjieff discusses this in this same chapter, Beelzebub's Opinion of War, where he talks about how the societies were trying to bring a more harmonious way of living, trying to teach people how to live in a more harmonious situation rather than living in this, as he says, crazy lunatic asylum. And these people were devoted to trying to explain to people, teach people how to live a more harmonious life. That's why they were saints. And people would listen to them and could see that it was a better way to live, for example, was by following, let's say, for example, Saint Muhammad or Saint Jesus Christ or Saint Ashiata Shirmash, as Gurdjieff talks about these different people in his books. But over time, after they've passed on and then their teachings have carried on, they get decimated and, weakened, diluted, I suppose. But one of these groups was trying to say that the earth is equally free for all. In fact, I'll just read that paragraph about this. So they've made this decision that they're going to try and make things better for everyone and to teach them about, the processes of reciprocal destruction and how everything eats everything. And, obviously there is evil out there, but what causes this evil? And they were saying, this is what he writes. So this is about the society. Having devoted themselves to the carrying out of this decision of theirs, they then began to visit various countries of the continent Asia, and everywhere very movingly preached the colossal criminality and sin of these actions of men, and in this way they found many people earnestly with them. And as a consequence of all their impartial and truly philanthropic labours, there was formed in the city Mosolopolis the mentioned large and serious society of men beings under the title "The Earth is Equally Free for All." And this is something that I feel we really need to try and stress to people, that people can have different ideas, different views, as long as they're not harming another. The earth should be equally free for all. But we seem to be living in a time where they're trying to tell us what to think and do and have in their bodies. And there does seem to be a colossal criminality going on and a sin against people's freedom. We are free beings, I think the only entity that I would probably listen to would be the divine source, if he or it came down and told me what I had to do. But I don't like it that the wrong kind of people are in charge. And I've discussed in other shows about how Gurdjieff says if there was a certain amount of people that were fully harmonised, fully have all their centres working properly and in motion, they would be more awake, and awakened beings would be able to lead the people in a more harmonious way of living. But many people don't like being told what to do, and that's understandable. We've had many criminal leaders over the centuries, which has gone into the human psyche and stops people wanting to have to obey the laws that these silly criminals put down upon us, which they think they're doing for our betterment. But we have this rebellious streak in us that we want to be free beings, really. But the sheep, those that are asleep, like to be told what to do. So they will go along with any agenda that's out there because they just want an easy life. Where people like ourselves, who are a bit more awakened, understand that we want to be free beings, to be able to do what we want. I'm pretty sure that people that watch my shows aren't people that are going out hurting anybody. They probably just want a nice peaceful life and to get on with everybody and everybody to get on with them. But carrying on about this, the earth is equally free for all. Gurdjieff writes, already, quite from the beginning, the members of the Society of Men Beings actualized to this end many things which no beings of the earth, either before or since, were able to actualize. And they were able to do this only because the program itself from the very beginning was very well drawn up in respect of its actualizability in the conditions existing there. Among other things, there entered into the fundamental program of this society gradually to act in such a direction as would enable them to obtain a result, in the first place, the actualization for all the beings of the continent Asia of one common religion, which they wished to base upon the teaching of the sect of what are called the Parsis, only changing it a little. Secondly, one common language, and for this common language they wished to adopt what is called the Turkoman language, the oldest on the continent, and one whose roots had already entered into very many Asiatic languages. And thirdly, there entered into the fundamental program of this society finally to bring about the organization in the center of Asia, namely in the city Marjalan, the capital of what was called the Fergananian Khanate, of a chief and basic government for all the countries of Asia under the name of the Council of the Elders, the members of which had to be honourable beings from all the Asiatic communities. Now all that sounds lovely. This is me speaking now, ending the quote, sorry. But, also sounds a bit New World Order, isn't it? One rule, one religion, one language, one currency, and so on and so on. Would it work? Does it work? Does it mean people no longer have the right to think for themselves or have their own beliefs? What happens to those that want to think differently? This is the problem. On this earth, we're very many different peoples. Very many different peoples means many very different views and ideas and beliefs. And, I'd like to think that if we weren't living under this kind of totalitarian way of living, people would want to be doing things for the betterment of themselves and their neighbours. And then that way we could all live in a more harmonious way. But Gurdjieff goes on to say that sometimes when there's learned people out there and they're all coming with different views, it can cause confusion and agitation, and then that starts causing disputes among people, and they're not being together in their ideas and trying to help each other. Instead, one person's trying to put across their idea and saying their idea is the best and poo-pooing other people's ideas. As he says, people become jealous and they also become greedy, and these are all malignant functions within them. he says, some of those began without logical criticism to take convincingly on faith all the hypotheses made in the theory. Others, however, did not fail, as is in general proper to most of the learned beings of the earth, to speak and to prove quite the opposite of these hypotheses, and as a result they worked themselves up into a state of enmity, not only against the theory of Atenarch, but even personally against him himself. And Atenarch was a fellow who came into these special societies, the earth is equally free for all, and began to put forward theories that people hadn't thought about before, which began to cause a bit of a change in the hierarchy and a bit of a panic in the hierarchy, as it says here. They didn't like all these different ideas. You know, he was trying to work out why people still went to war. Gurdjieff talks about how there began quarrels and disturbances among all the people, among the learned beings and among the ordinary beings, and this was causing an inflaming of their abnormal psyche. You know, and that's what's been going on in the last few years, really, an inflaming of the abnormal psyche. People want to argue amongst themselves of who's right, who's wrong, what theory is happening, what theory is true, which conspiracy theory is coming true, which conspiracy theory is here to confuse people. And as he says, all the members of the serious society gradually calmed down and started anew peaceably and seriously to ponder and deliberate upon just what to do in the future. And I can see there is different societies out there, New World Order and such like, that are trying to do that. They're trying to ponder and deliberate what is best for us, without really being concerned of people being free to do as they wish. And Gurdjieff explains that people are always looking for someone to help them, always looking for a leader to show them the way. And sometimes people maybe pick someone that's perhaps not right for it, and then those that are right for it, we seem to poo-poo. But most of these arguments are about how to stop war, how to make people live in a more harmonious way. And Gurdjieff reminds us, according to the laws of nature, there must periodically always proceed on the earth, independently of the will of men, wars and civil wars, and this is because during certain periods there is required for nature a greater quantity of deaths. In view of this, we are all, with much grief, but with inevitable inner resignation, compelled to agree that by no mental decisions of man is it possible to abolish the shedding of blood between states and within states themselves, and we therefore unanimously resolve to wind up current affairs and everything done by our society, and perforce disperse for home, and there to drag out our inescapable burden of life. And this is something we all suffer with, the burden of life. But this is where the Gurdjieff work comes in to help us. It helps us to understand what this burden of life is, how to work with it, and how to develop ourselves so that it doesn't become a burden. Instead, we realize what we should be doing, what our mission should be in our life. It helps us to work with our true consciousness and our true being, our real I, where when all these quarrels and disturbances and all these arguments amongst people, whether it's governments, wars, just your own social life, this is not our real I. He reminds people, well, he's talking about the society here, and it's this Atenarch speaking. You have laboured unceasingly for some years to obtain for the masses the most necessary welfare, and although I too have worked upon my theory for many years, also for people unknown to me, nevertheless it has been the cause of the frustration of your indefatigable labours and benevolent aspirations. The consciousness that it seems that I am to blame for all the misunderstandings which have arisen among you has given me no peace during these last days, and I have been thinking and pondering all the time whether it is not possible somehow to repair this involuntary fault of mine. And so, wise colleagues, elected from the whole earth, I wish to share with you the final conclusion to which these deliberations of mine have brought me. If the universal laws I've discovered are opposed to the means you expected might bring a certain happiness to mankind, then, however strange it may seem to you at first glance, if only these same laws be employed otherwise, they might serve for the attainment of this aim we have set for ourselves. Now listen to what we must do to attain this aim. The results of all my researches clearly prove that nature requires that at certain periods a certain number of deaths should take place on the earth, and at the same time I have succeeded in making clear that for the needs of nature it is indifferent which deaths these are, whether deaths of people themselves or deaths of the lives of other forms of being. From this it follows that if the number of deaths required by nature is made up by the deaths of other forms of lives on the earth, then obviously the need for the number of deaths of men themselves will thus be of itself correspondingly reduced. And it will be quite possible to attain to this if all the members of our society continue to work with the same intensity, not only with the aim of realizing our former program, but of reviving upon the earth on a larger scale than before the ancient custom among men of offering sacrifices to their gods and saints by destroying the lives of other forms. Well, this to me, Debbie speaking, doesn't make sense, but obviously this is Beelzebub trying to explain the different ways that people work. If we had learned beings on this planet, people that were developed and awake, it would make a better style of life for one and all. But this is what Gurdjieff's trying to explain. There's too many people thinking they know the right way, and they're people that are leading us that are not awake. Later on in this same chapter, Beelzebub is talking to his grandson Hussein. And his grandson Hussein is us really. We're learning from Beelzebub. And Hussein saying in a tone full of despair, "How will it all end? Is there really no way out at all? Must these unfortunate souls who were formed on that unfortunate planet really remain eternally unperfected and be endlessly coded into various planetary forms and everlasting toil and moil on account of the consequences of the properties of that accursed organ Kunda buffer, which, owing to the reasons extraneous to them themselves, was attached to the planetary bodies of the first free-centred beings of that ill-fated planet? Where then is that pillar upon which, as it were, our whole megalocosmos rests, and which is called justice? No, this cannot be. Something is wrong here, because during the whole time of my existence not once has a single doubt ever crept into me as to the existence of objective justice. And all I have to do is just to clarify and understand. Why? At any rate, from this present moment, the aim of my existence shall be to understand clearly why the souls arising in these terrestrial free-centred beings are in such an unprecedented, terrifying situation." Having said this, poor Hussein, full of melancholy, drooped his head and became sadly thoughtful. Now these are the kinds of questions we should be asking, and hopefully you have been, and that's why you've come to this kind of work, because you're looking to understand why people are like this. Where is the social pillar of justice? And as many of us know, there isn't one. But Beelzebub replies, "Yes, my dear Hussein, certainly there is something not quite right here. But if nothing could be done for the beings of that planet by that being who now already has the reason of the sacred Pud-Kulad, and is one of the first assistants of our endlessness in the government of the world, namely the very saintly Ashiata Shirmash, if he could do nothing, what then can we expect, we, beings with the reason of almost ordinary beings? You remember the very saintly Ashiata Shirmash, then in his deliberations, under the title of the terror of the situation, said, 'If it is still possible to save the beings of the earth, then time alone can do it.' We can now only repeat the same in regard to these terrible properties of theirs, of which we have just been speaking, namely their periodic processes of the destruction of each other's existence. We can only say now that if this property of terrestrial beings is to disappear from that unfortunate planet, then it will be with time alone, thanks either to the guidance of a certain being with very high reason, or to certain exceptional cosmic events." Having said this, Beelzebub began to look at Hussein with that same strange look. So, will people listen to a certain being with very high reason? Most of those people that have come to this planet and have worked on that and became the certain being with very high reason ended up being persecuted, perhaps killed by the masses, mainly because, stupidity breeds in large groups of people, and people don't like being shown when they're wrong. They don't like being shown that their way of life is wrong, even if they do know deep down in their hearts that the way they live does not make sense. They make excuses for it. Oh, that's just life. Or, I have people saying to me, we need evil to appreciate the good. Not really. Don't really want some poor little child being attacked by some paedophile just so that we can appreciate the good. It just doesn't make sense. But if we had a learned being that came and taught everybody the right way, I'd like to think the majority would listen. But this is the kind of thing that Gurdjieff was trying to explain. If people can work on themselves and develop themselves to become that learned being with a high reason or a higher understanding, a higher conscience, that is a great example to set out to people. And maybe other people will start listening, and it will start that roller coaster of vibrations spreading out, and other people wanting to be like that. It's only the stubborn and the stupid that don't want to evolve. Now, I mentioned earlier the law of the reciprocal maintenance. And I'm going to do a little quote here from the Man's Understanding of Justice chapter in Beelzebub's Tales, where it explains what this is. So, quoting, evidently we men also, like all the existing units of the world, and formed and always consist of the same free independent forces, by means of which the process of reciprocal maintenance of everything existing proceeds, namely of the following free independent world forces. The first of these forces constantly arises from the causes which proceed in the prime source itself and from the pressure of the newly arisen, and issuing from it by momentum flows out of that prime source. The second world force is what this first force becomes when, after having spent the momentum which it has received, it strives to reblend with the source of its arising, according to the fundamental world law called, the effects of a cause must always re-enter the cause. Both of these forces in the general process of reciprocally maintaining forces are entirely independent, and in their manifestations have always and in everything their own properties and particularities. The first of these two fundamental forces, namely, that one which for compelling reasons always manifests outside the source of its arising, must constantly involve, and the second one, on the contrary, striving to blend with the cause of its arising, must always and in everything evolve. Owing to the fact that the first of the mentioned free independent forces arising from vivifying actions proceeding in the very foundation of the cause of everything existing, and thus receives in its presence the germ of the possibility of manifesting vivifyingness, it may be considered as good, that is, as a factor for the actualizing of the backward flowing effects, which in relation to this first force can and must be considered as evil. Moreover, the first of these forces, which is manifested from inevitable and compelling causes arising in the prime source itself, can, from this point of view, be considered as passive, and the second backward flowing force, because it must constantly resist in order to have the possibility of penetrating backward, or at least the possibility of withstanding the opposite flowing first passive force, which has received its momentum from the prime source causes, must be regarded as active. And as for the third independent world force, this force is nothing else but only the result of the clash everywhere and in everything of these two fundamental descending and ascending independent forces. Although this third independent force is only the result of both first fundamental forces, it is nevertheless the spiritualizing and reconciling source of every world formation. And it is the spiritualizing source of every world formation because it arises and must exist in them as a presence all the time, while the given results exist which arise from various unusual mutual resistances occurring between the said two fundamental forces, flowing in entirely opposite directions. And so, my boy, it was in this sense and in this meaning that the words good and evil were first used by this unfortunate Macarai Crombono Zion. Macarai Crombono Zion is one of the characters in All and Everything. So they're trying to discuss good and evil, which is something what's making people believe this is why they can be two forces in the world, but it's actually three forces. As Gurdjieff reminds us, wholly affirming, wholly denying, wholly reconciling, transubstantiating me for my being. We're trying to reconcile these forces within us so that we can then work with them and help reconcile them in this planet and this planet's development. It's not just us that can either evolve or involve, so can planet Earth. And I don't want the Earth to devolve. I don't want it to involve. I want it to evolve and create and follow on to its next stage. And one way of doing this work is through what Gurdjieff calls special observations. And in the chapter The Terror of the Situation, he gives us instructions of how to do this. During the period of my year of special observations and all of their manifestations and perceptions, I made it categorically clear to myself that although the factors for engendering in their presences the sacred being impulses of faith, hope and love, already quite degenerated in the beings of this planet, nevertheless, the factor which ought to engender that being impulse on which the whole psyche of beings of a free brain system is in general based, and which impulse exists under the name of objective conscience, is not yet atrophied in them, but remains in their presences almost in its primordial state. Thanks to the abnormally established conditions of external ordinary being existence existing here, this factor has gradually penetrated and become embedded in that consciousness which is here called subconsciousness, in consequence of which it takes no part whatever in the functioning of their ordinary consciousness. Well then, it was just then that I indubitably understood, with all the separate ruminating parts representing the whole of my I, that if the functioning of that being factor still surviving in their common presences were to participate in the general functioning of that consciousness of theirs, in which they pass their daily, as they here say, waking existence, only then would it still be possible to save the contemporary free-brained beings here from the consequences of the properties of that organ which was intentionally implanted into their first ancestors. My further meditations then confirmed for me that it would be possible to attain this only if their general being existence were to flow for a long time under foreseeingly corresponding conditions. When all the above mentioned was completely transubstantiated in me, I decided to consecrate the whole of myself from that time on to the creation here of such conditions that the functioning of the sacred conscience, still surviving in their subconsciousness, might gradually pass into the functioning of their ordinary consciousness. May the blessings of our almighty, omni-loving, common Father, uni-being, creator, endlessness be upon my decision. Amen. Thus ended the legomenism concerning the deliberations of the very saintly, incomparable Ashiata Shirmash, under the title of The Terror of the Situation. So, my boy, when, as I have already told you, early in my last descent in person onto the surface of your planet, I first became acquainted in detail with this legomenism, which I have just repeated, and had at once become interested in the deductions of this later, most high, very saintly, common cosmic individual, Ashiata Shirmash, there existed neither any other legomenisms nor any other sources of information concerning his further very saintly activities among these favourites of yours. So I then decided to investigate in detail and without fail to make clear to myself which were the measures he took and how he subsequently actualized them, in order to help these unfortunates to deliver themselves from the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, which had passed to them by heredity and was so maleficent for them. And so, as one of my chief tasks during this last sojourn of mine in person there, on the surface of your planet, I made a detailed investigation and elucidation of the whole of the further, very saintly activities there among your favourites of that great, essence-loving, now most high, very saintly common cosmic individual, Ashiata Shirmash. And as regards the marble tablet which has been by chance survived since the time of the very saintly activities of the great Ashiata Shirmash, and is now there the principal sacred relic of the brotherhood of the initiated beings called the Brotherhood Ol Begobmek. I happened to see and read the contents engraved on it during this last sojourn of mine there. During my subsequent elucidations it turned out that later on, when this very saintly Ashiata Shirmash had established there the particular conditions of ordinary being existence which he had planned, several of these tablets were, on his advice and initiative, set up in corresponding places of many of the large towns, and there were engraved upon them all kinds of sayings and counsels for corresponding existence. But when their big wars later on again began, all these tablets were also destroyed by these strange beings themselves, and only one of them, namely that one now with these brethren, somehow survived, as I've already told you, and is now the property of this brotherhood. On this still surviving marble are inscriptions concerning the sacred being impulses called faith, love, and hope, namely, faith, love, and hope. Faith of consciousness is freedom. Faith of feeling is weakness. Faith of body is stupidity. Love of consciousness evokes the same in response. Love of feeling evokes the opposite. Love of body depends only on type and polarity. Hope of consciousness is strength. Hope of feeling is slavery. Hope of body is disease. So these kind of inner impulses are what we should be working upon. And we should be working upon these so they go down into our subconscious, because they're in our subconscious anyway. We need to be bringing them up into our consciousness so that we can start working with them in our everyday, workings. Wherever we are, we need to be putting these forward and making use of them and thinking, feeling and being in this way. We should have a strong desire to want to do this work so that we can have the salvation for our own souls and the salvation for everybody else's souls, because we can help others. Once we've worked upon ourselves, others will start recognizing, you are a learned being and they want to be like you. It takes a lot of required being efforts, but it's something we can do if we desire it, if we have the right aim, if we can work upon ourselves and not get distracted, which we do, it happens. We need to have faith in ourselves, we need to have love in ourselves, and we need to have the hope. But, as he says, faith of consciousness is freedom, faith of feeling is weakness, faith of body is stupidity. Love of consciousness evokes the same in response. Love of feeling evokes the opposite. Love of body depends only on type and polarity. Hope of consciousness is strength. Hope of feeling is slavery. Hope of body is disease. And we want to be free enough, free people of this earth, so that we can develop ourselves, so that we have the transubstantiation happening in us, wholly affirming, wholly denying, wholly reconciling, transubstantiating me for my being. And hopefully we can put that out into the world. Though, as he says, hope can be a feeling of slavery. But then if there's no hope, it's despair. And we don't want to be in despair. We need to be active and working. So we should be working on our planetary bodies. We're free-centered beings. And with this, we have the sacred being impulses of faith, hope, and love. And the writings of Ashiata Shirmash began with a prayer, as all things should. It's something Gurdjieff recommended for everything. Always start with a prayer before you start any project, situation, life. You should start your mornings with a prayer. But this is the prayer Ashiata Shirmash began with. In the name of the causes of my arising, I shall always strive to be just towards every already spiritualized origination, and towards all the originations of the future spiritualized manifestations of our common Creator, Almighty Autocrat Endlessness. Amen. And I know people go on about the word amen. It does mean so be it. Though some people relate it to certain Egyptian gods. I like to use the word, as I say, as the meaning of so be it. And really when we speak words, it's what our intention is behind them that it puts forward. So thank you for listening to my ramble today. look after this beautiful planet Earth, look after your planetary bodies, and go forward with faith, hope, love. Thank you, Mr.